Chapter 18: The Mediumship of Bessie Fitzgerald. One evening I went to have a cup of tea with my friend Miss Gutenberg at Shepherd's Bush, when she proposed that we should go and have a séance with Mrs. Henry Jenkin, Kate Fox, who lived close by. I hailed the idea, as I had heard such great things of the medium in question, and never had an opportunity of testing them. Consequently, I was proportionately disappointed when, on sending round to her house to ask if she could receive us that evening, we received a message to say that Mr. Jenkin, her husband, had died that morning, and she could see no one. Miss Gutenberg and I immediately cast about in our minds to see what we should do with our time, and she suggested we should call on Mrs. Fitzgerald. "Who is Mrs. Fitzgerald?" I queried.
"A wonderful medium,"
replied my friend,
"whom I met at Mrs. Wilson's last week, and who gave me leave to call on her. Let us go together."
And accordingly we set forth for Mrs. Fitzgerald's residence in the Goldhawk Road. I only mention these circumstances to show how utterly unpremeditated was my first visit to her. We arrived at her house, and were ushered into a sitting room, Miss Gutenberg only sending up her name. In a few minutes the door opened, and a small, fair woman, dressed in black velvet, entered the room. Miss Gutenberg saluted her, and was about to tender some explanation regarding my presence there, when Mrs. Fitzgerald walked straight up to me and took my hand. Her eyes seemed to dilate and contract, like the opening and shutting off of a light, in a manner which I have often seen since, and she uttered rapidly,
"You have been married once, you have been married twice, and you will be married a third time."
I answered, "If you know anything, Mrs. Fitzgerald, you must know that I am very much attached to my husband, and that your information can give me no pleasure to hear."
"No,"
she said.
"No. I suppose not, but you cannot alter fate."
She then proceeded to speak of things in my past life which had had the greatest influence over the whole of it, occurrences of so private and important a nature that it becomes impossible to write them down here, and for that very reason doubly convincing to the person whom they concern. Presently Mrs. Fitzgerald wandered to her piano, and commenced to play the air of the ballad so firmly connected in my mind with John Powell's, "Thou art gone from my gaze," whilst she turned and nodded at me saying,
"He's here."
In fact, after a couple of hours' conversation with her, I felt that this stranger in the black velvet dress had turned out every secret of my life, and laid it naked and bare before me. I was wonderfully attracted to her. Her personality pleased me, her lonely life, living with her 2 babies in the Goldhawk Road, made me anxious to give her society and pleasure, and her wonderful gifts of clairvoyance and trance mediumship, all combined to make me desire her friendship, and I gave her a cordial invitation to my house in the Regent's Park, where for some years she was a constant visitor, and always sure of a hearty welcome. It was due to her kindness that I first had the opportunity to study trance mediumship at my leisure, and in a short time we became so familiar with her most constant control, Dewdrop, a Red Indian girl, and so accustomed to speak through Mrs. Fitzgerald with our own friends gone before, that we welcomed her advent to our house as the signal for holding a spiritual party. For the sake of the uninitiated and curious, I think I had better here describe what is meant by trance mediumship. A person thus gifted has the power of giving him or herself up to the control of the influences in command, who send him or her off to sleep, a sleep so deep and so like death that the spirit is actually parted pro tem from the body, which other spirits, sometimes living, but far oftener dead, enter and use as if it were their own. I have mentioned in my chapter on embodied spirits how my living friend in India conversed with me through Bessie Fitzgerald in this way, also how Florence spoke to me through the unconscious lips of Mabel Kenningelkirk. Of course, I am aware that it would be so easy for a medium simply to close her eyes, and, professing to be entranced, talk a lot of commonplaces, which open-mouthed fools might accept as a new gospel, that it becomes imperative to test this class of media strictly by what they utter, and to place no faith in them until you are convinced that the matters they speak of cannot possibly have been known to anyone except the friend whose mouthpiece they profess to be. All this I fully proved for myself from repeated trials and researches, but the unfortunate part of it is, that the more forcible and convincing the private proof, the more difficult it is to place it before the public. I must content myself, therefore, with saying that some of my dead friends, so-called, came back to me so frequently through Bessie Fitzgerald, and familiarized themselves so completely with my present life, that I forgot sometimes that they had left this world, and flew to them, or rather to Bessie, to seek their advice or ask their sympathy as naturally as if she were their earthly form. Of these my daughter Florence was necessarily the most often with me, and she and Dewdrop generally divided the time which Mrs. Fitzgerald spent with us between them. I never saw a control so completely identified with its medium as Dewdrop was with Bessie. It was difficult at times to know which was which, and one could never be certain until she spoke whether the spirit or the medium had entered the house. When she did speak, however, there was no mistaking them. Their characters were so different. Bessie Fitzgerald, a quiet, soft-spoken little woman, devoted to her children, and generally unobtrusive; Dewdrop, a Sioux Indian girl, wary and deep as her tribe and cute and saucy as a Yankee, with an amount of devilry in her that must at times have proved very inconvenient. She used to play Mrs. Fitzgerald tricks in those days that might have brought her into serious trouble, such as controlling her whilst traveling in an omnibus, and talking her Yankee Indian to the passengers until she had made their hair stand on end, with the suspicion that they had a lunatic for a companion. One evening we had a large and rather swell evening party, chiefly composed of ladies and gentlemen of the theatrical profession, and entirely of non-spiritualists, excepting ourselves. Mrs. Fitzgerald had been invited to this party, and declined, because it was out of her line. We were therefore rather astonished, when all the guests were assembled, to hear her name announced and see her enter the room in a morning dress. Directly I cast eyes upon her, however, I saw that it was not herself, but Dewdrop. The stride with which she walked, the waggish way she rolled from side to side, the devilry in her eye, all betokened the Indian control. To make matters worse, she went straight up to Colonel Lean, and, throwing herself on the ground at his feet, affectionately laid her head upon his knee, and said,
"Bice come to the party."
Imagine the astonishment of our guests. I was obliged at once, in defense of my friend, to explain to them how matters stood, and though they looked rather incredulous, they were immensely interested, and Dewdrop's visit proved to be the event of the evening. She talked to each one separately, telling them home truths, and prophesying their future in a way that made their cheeks go pale with fright, or red with conscious shame, and there was quite a contest between the men as to who should take Dewdrop down to the supper table. When there, she made herself particularly lively, making personal remarks aloud that were, in some instances, rather trying to listen to, and which Bessie Fitzgerald would have cut out her tongue sooner than utter. She ate, too, of dishes which would have made Bessie ill for a week. This was another strange peculiarity of Dewdrop's control. She not only ousted the spirit, she regulated the internal machinery of her medium's body. Bessie in her normal condition was a very delicate woman with a weak heart and lungs, and obliged to be most careful in her diet. She ate like a sparrow, and of the simplest things. Dewdrop, on the other hand, liked indigestible food, and devoured it freely, yet Bessie has told me that she never felt any inconvenience from the food amalgamated with her system whilst under Dewdrop's control. One day when Mrs. Fitzgerald was dining with us, we had some apples at dessert, which she would have liked to partake of, but was too much afraid of the after consequences.
I dare not,
She said.
If I were to eat a raw apple, I should have indigestion for a week.
She took some preserved ginger instead, and we were proceeding with our dessert, when I saw her hand steal out and grasp an apple. I looked in her face. Dewdrop had taken her place. Dewdrop, I said, authoritatively, you must not eat that. You will hurt Bessie. Put it down directly.
"I shan't,"
replied Dewdrop, drawing the dish towards her.
"I like apples. I'm always wanting me to eat them, and she won't, so she must go wait till I've had as many as I want."
And in effect she ate 3 or 4 of them, and Bessie would never have been cognizant of the fact unless I had informed her. On the occasion of the party to which she came uninvited, Dewdrop remained with us to the very last, and went home in a cab, and landed Mrs. Fitzgerald at her house without her being aware that she had ever left it. At that time we were constantly at each other's houses, and many an evening have I spent alone with Bessie in the Gold Hawk Road, her servant out marketing and her little children asleep in the room overhead. Her baby was then a great fat fellow of about 15 months old, who was given to waking and crying for his mother. If Dewdrop were present, she was always very impatient with these interruptions.
"Bother Dad, George.
she would say.
I must go up and quiet him.
Then she would disappear for a few minutes, while Bessie woke and talked to me, and then, in the twinkling of an eye, Dewdrop would be back again. One day, apparently, George would not be comforted, for on Dewdrop's return she said to me,
It's no good. I've had to bring him down. He's on the mat outside the door.
And there, sure enough, we found the poor baby wailing in his nightshirt. Not being able to walk, how he had been spirited from the top story to the bottom I leave my readers to determine. Bess's little girl Mabel promised to be as wonderful a medium as her mother. She would come in from the garden flushed from her play with the spirit children, of whom she talked as familiarly as of her little neighbors next door. I have watched her playing at ball with an invisible child, and have seen the ball thrown, arrested halfway in the air, and then tossed back again just as if a living child had been Mab's opponent. I had lost several infants from premature birth during my second marriage, and the eldest of these, a girl, appeared to be a constant companion of Mabel's. She was always talking of what Mrs. Lean's girl, as she called her, had done and said, and one day she had a violent fit of weeping because her mother would not promise to buy her a frock like the one Mrs. Lean's girl wore. Apropos of these stillborn children, I had a curious experience with Mrs. Fitzgerald. I had had no idea until then that children so born possessed any souls, or lived again, but Florence undeceived me when she told me she had charge of her little brothers and sisters. She even professed to know the names by which they were known in the spirit world. When a stillborn baby is launched upon the other side, she said it is delivered over to the nearest relative of its parent, to be called by what name he may choose. Thus my first girl was christened by Colonel Lean's mother Gertrude, after a bosom friend of hers, and my second my father named Joan, as he said it was his favorite female name. Upon subsequent inquiry, we found that Mrs. Lean had a friend called Gertrude, and that Joan was distinctly Captain Marryat's beau ideal of a woman's name. However, that signified but little. I became very curious to see or speak with these unknown babies of mine, and used to worry Florence to bring them to me. She would expostulate with me after this fashion.
Dear mother, be reasonable. Remember what babies they are, and that this world is quite strange to them. When your earthly children were small, you never allowed them to be brought down before strangers, for fear they should cry. Gertie and Yanni would behave just the same if I brought them back to you now.
However, I went on teasing her till she made the attempt, and Gertie returned through Mrs. Fitzgerald. It was a long time before we could coax her to remain with us, and when she overcame her first shyness, it was like talking to a little savage. Gertie didn't know the meaning of anything, or the names of anything. Her incessant questions of what's a father? What's a mother? What's a dog? Were very difficult to answer, but she would chatter about the spirit world, and what she did there, as glibly as possible. She told us that she knew her brother Francis, the lad who was drowned at sea, very well, and she ran races, and Francis chivied her, and when he caught her, he held her under the fountain, and the spray wetted her frock, and made it look like silver. The word chivet sounding to me very much of a mundane character, I asked Gertie where she learned it, and she said, Francis says chivy, so I may, and it was indeed a common expression with him. Gertie took, after a while, such a keen interest in my ornaments and china, rather to their endangerment, that I bought a doll to see if she would play with it. At first she was vastly delighted with the little spirit, as she called it, and nursed it just as a mortal child would have done. But when she began to question me as to the reason the doll did not look at her, or answer her, or move about, and I said it was because it was not alive, she was dreadfully disappointed. Not alive, she echoed, didn't God make it? And when I replied in the negative, she threw it to the other end of the room, and would never look at it again. Gertie was about 5 years old at this period, and seemed to have a great idea of her own importance. She always announced herself as the Princess Gertie, and was very dignified in her behavior. One day, when a lady friend was present when Gertie came and asked her to kiss her, she extended her hand instead of her face, saying, "You may kiss my hand." Yonnai, as Joan called herself, was but 18 months old, and used to manifest herself, roaring like a child forcibly dragged before strangers, and the only word we could ever extract from her was sugar plums. Accordingly, I invested in some for her benefit, with which she filled her mouth so full as nearly to choke the medium, and Florence rebuked me seriously for my carelessness, and threatened never to bring yon night down to this earth again. There had been 3 other children, boys, whom I was equally anxious to see again, but, for some inexplicable reason, Florence said it was impossible that they could manifest. The little girls, however, came until we were quite familiar with them. I am aware that all this must sound very childish, but had it not borne a remarkable context, I should not have related it. All the wonder of it will be found later on. Mrs. Fitzgerald suffered very much at this time from insomnia, which she always declared was benefited after a visit to me. I proposed one night, therefore, when she had stayed with us later than usual, that she should remain and share my bed, and return home in the morning. She consented, and at the usual hour we retired to rest together, I taking care to lock the bedroom door and keep the gas burning. Indeed, Bessie was so nervous of what she might see that she would not have remained in the dark for any consideration. The bed we occupied was what is called a half-tester, with a canopy and curtains on either side. As soon as ever Bessie got into it, she burrowed under the clothes like a dormouse, and went fast asleep. I was too curious to see what might happen to follow her example, so my head remained on the pillow, and my eyes wide open, and turning in every direction. Presently I saw the curtains on the opposite side of the bed gently shaken, next a white hand and arm appeared round them, and was passed up and down the ridge that represented Bessie Fitzgerald's body. Finally, after several times stepping forward and retreating again, a female figure emerged and walked to the foot of the bedstead and stood there regarding me. She was, to all appearance, as solidly formed as any human creature could be, and she was as perfectly distinct as though seen by daylight. Her head and bust reminded me at once of the celebrated Clytie, they were so classically and beautifully formed. Her hair and skin were fair, her eyes luminously liquid and gentle, her whole attitude one of modest dignity. She was clothed in some creamy white material, thick and soft, and intermixed with dull gold. She wore no ornaments, but in her right hand she carried a long branch of palm, or olive, or myrtle, something tall and tapering, and of dark green. She scarcely could be said to smile at me, but there was an indescribable appearance of peace and tranquillity about her. When I described this apparition to Bessie in the morning, she recognized it at once as that of her control, Goodness, whom she had seen clairvoyantly, but she affirmed that I was the only person who had ever given her a correct description of this influence, which was the best and purest about her. After Goodness had remained in the same position for a few minutes, she walked back again behind the curtain, which served as a cabinet, and Florence came out and had a whispered conversation with me. Next a dark face, but only a face, said to be that of Dewdrop, peeped out 4 or 5 times, and disappeared again. Then a voice said,
"No more. Good night."
And I turned round to where Bessie lay sleeping beside me, and went to sleep myself. After that, she often came, when suffering worse than usual from insomnia, to pass the night with me, as she said my magnetism caused her to sleep, and similar manifestations always occurred when we were alone and together. Mrs. Fitzgerald's mediumship was by no means used, however, for the sole purpose of gratifying curiosity or foretelling the future. She was a wonderful medical diagnoser, and sat for a long time in the service of a well-known medical man. She would be ensconced in a corner of his waiting room and tell him the exact disease of each patient that entered. She told me she could see the inside of everybody as perfectly as though they were made of glass. This gift, however, induced her to take on a reflection, as it were, of the disease she diagnosed, and after a while her failing strength compelled her to give it up. Her control Dewdrop was what she called herself, a metal spirit, i.e., her advice was very trustworthy with regard to all speculations and monetary transactions. Many stockbrokers and city men used regularly to consult Bessie before they engaged in any speculation, and she received many valuable presents in return for her assistance in making a pile. One gentleman, indeed, settled a large sum of money when he died on her little son in gratitude for the fortune Dewdrop had helped him to accumulate. Persons who sneer at spiritualism and declare it to be useless, little know how much advantage is taken of spiritual forethought and provision by those who believe in it. I have never been sorry but when I have neglected to follow the advice of a medium whom I had proved to be trustworthy. In the autumn of 1883 I introduced my own entertainment of love letters to the provincial British public, and it had an immediate and undeniable success. My engagements poured in rapidly, and I had already booked dates for the whole spring of 1884, when Mr. Edgar Bruce offered me an engagement at the Prince of Wales, then the Prince's, Theatre, about to be opened in Piccadilly. I had been anxiously waiting to obtain an engagement on the London boards, and was eager to accept it. Still, I did not know if I would be wise in relinquishing my provincial engagements. I wrote to Bessie to ask Dewdrop what I should do. The answer was, "Don't accept, only a flash in the pan." Thereupon I sent to Mr. Bruce to ask how long the engagement was likely to last, and his answer was that he expected the Palace of Truth to run a year at least, and at any rate I was to consider myself one of a stock company. Thereupon I cancelled all my entertainment engagements, returned to London, appeared at the Prince's Theatre for just 11 weeks, and got into 4 lawsuits with my disappointed patrons for my trouble. It is one of the commonest remarks made by stupid people: if the spirits know anything, let them tell me the name of the winner of the derby, and then I will believe them, etc. I was speaking of this once to Dewdrop, and she said,
We could tell if we choose, but we are not allowed to do so. If spiritualism was generally used for such things, all the world would rush to it in order to cheat one another. But if you will promise me not to open it until after the derby is run, I will give you the name of the winner now in a sealed envelope, to prove that what I say is the truth.
We gave her the requisite materials, and she made a few pencil marks on a piece of paper, and sealed it up. It was the year that Shotover won the derby. The day after the race, we opened the envelope and found the drawing of a man with a gun in his hand, a hedge, and a bird flying away on the other side, very sketchy, but perfectly intelligible to one who could read between the lines. I was at the theatre one night with Bessie in a box, when I found out that Dewdrop had taken her place. Dewdrop was very fond of going to the play, and her remarks were so funny and so naive as to keep one constantly amused. Presently, between the acts, she said to me,
Do you see that man in the front row of the stalls with a bald head, sitting next to the old lady with a fat neck?
I replied I did.
Now you watch,
said Dewdrop.
I'm going down there to have some fun. First I'll tickle the old man's head, and then I'll scratch the old woman's neck. Now, you and Meaty watch.
The next moment Bessie spoke to me in her own voice, and I told her what Dewdrop proposed to do.
Oh, poor things.
She said, compassionately.
How she will torment them.
To watch what followed was a perfect farce. First, the old man put his hand up to his bald head, and then he took out his handkerchief and flicked it, then he rubbed it, and finally scrubbed it to alleviate the increasing irritation. Then the old lady began the same business with her neck, and finding it of no avail, glared at the old man as if she thought he had done it. In fact, they were both in such evident torture that there was no doubt Dewdrop had kept her promise. When she returned to me she said,
There. Didn't you see me walking along the front row of stalls, in my moccasins and beads and feathers, and all my war paint on, tickling the old fellow's head?
I didn't see you, Dewdrop, I answered, but I'm sure you were there.
But the old fellow felt me, and so did the old girl.
She replied. Bessie Fitzgerald is now Mrs. Russell Davies, and carries on her séances in Upper Norwood. No one who attends them can fail to feel interested in the various phenomena he will meet with there. Chapter 19: The Mediumship of Lottie Fowler. As I was introduced to Lottie Fowler many years before I met Bessie Fitzgerald, I suppose the account of her mediumship should have come first, but I am writing this veracious narrative on no fixed or artificial plan, but just as it occurs to me, though not from memory, because notes were taken of every particular at the time of occurrence. In 1874 I was largely employed on the London press, and constantly sent to report on anything novel or curious, and likely to afford matter for an interesting article. It was for such a purpose that I received an order from one of the principal newspapers in town to go and have a complimentary séance with an American clairvoyant newly arrived in England, Miss Lottie Fowler. Until I received my directions I had never heard the medium's name, and I knew very little of clairvoyance. She was lodging in Conduit Street, and I reached her house one morning as early as 10 o'clock, and sent in a card with the name of the paper only written on it. I was readily admitted. Miss Fowler was naturally anxious to be noticed by the press and introduced to London society. I found her a stylish-looking, well-dressed woman of about 30, with a pleasant, intelligent face. Those of my readers who have only met her since sickness and misfortune made inroads on her appearance may smile at my description, but I repeat that 17 years ago Lottie Fowler was prosperous and energetic-looking. She received me very cordially, and asked me into a little back parlour, of which, as it was summer weather, both the windows and doors were left open. Here, in the sunshine, she sat down and took my hand in hers, and began chatting of what she wished and hoped to do in London. Suddenly her eyes closed and her head fell back. She breathed hard for a few minutes, and then sat up, still with her eyes closed, and began to talk in a high key, and in broken English. This was her well-known control, Annie, without doubt one of the best clairvoyants living. She began by explaining to me that she had been a German girl in earth life, and couldn't speak English properly, but I should understand her better when I was more familiar with her. She then commenced with my birth by the sea, described my father's personality and occupation, spoke of my mother, my brothers and sisters, my illnesses, my marriage, and my domestic life. Then she said,
"Wait. Now I'll go to your house and tell you what I see there."
She then repeated the names of all my children, giving a sketch of the character of each one, down to the baby with the flower name, as she called my little Daisy. After she had really exhausted the subject of my past and present, she said,
"You'll say I've read all this out of your mind, so now I'll tell you what I see in the future. You'll be married a second time."
Now, at this period I was editing a fashionable magazine, and drew a large number of literary men around me. I kept open house on Tuesday evenings, and had innumerable friends, and I don't say I had, but I may have sometimes speculated what my fate might be in the event of my becoming free. The séance I speak of took place on a Wednesday morning, and when Annie told me I should be married a second time, my thoughts involuntarily took to themselves wings, I suppose, for she immediately followed up her assertion by saying,
"No. Not to the man who broke the tumbler at your house last night. You will marry another soldier."
"No, thank you," I exclaimed, "no more army men for me. I've had enough of soldiers to last me a lifetime." Annie looked very grave.
"You will marry another soldier,"
she reiterated.
"I can see him now, walking up a terrace. He is very tall and big, and has brown hair cut quite short, but so soft and shiny. At the back of his head he looks as sleek as a mole. He has a broad face, a pleasant, smiling face, and when he laughs he shows very white teeth. I see him knocking at your door. He says, 'Is Mrs. Rosschurch at home?' 'Yes, sir.' Then he goes into a room full of books. 'Florence, my wife is dead. Will you be my wife?' And you say yes."
Annie spoke so naturally, and I was so astonished at her knowledge of my affairs, that it never struck me till I returned home that she had called me by my name, which had been kept carefully from her. I asked her, "When will my husband die?"
"I don't see his death anywhere,"
she answered. "But how can I marry again unless he dies?" I said,
"I don't know, but I can't tell you what I don't see. I see a house all in confusion. Papers are thrown about, and everything is topsy-turvy, and two people are going different ways. And, oh, there is so much trouble and so many tears. But I don't see any death anywhere."
I returned home, very much astonished at all Miss Fowler had said regarding my past and present, but very incredulous with respect to her prophecies for the future. Yet, 3 years afterwards, when much of what she told me had come to pass, I was travelling from Charing Cross to Fareham with Mr. Grossmith, to give our entertainment of Entrenhouse, when the train stopped as usual to water at Chatham. On the platform stood Colonel Lean, in uniform, talking to some friends. I had never set eyes on him till that moment, but I said at once to Mr. Grossmith, "Do you see that officer in the undress uniform? That is the man Lottie Fowler told me I should marry." Her description had been so exact that I recognized him at once. Of course, I got well laughed at, and was ready after a while to laugh at myself. 2 months afterwards, however, I was engaged to recite at the Literary Institute at Chatham, where I had never set foot in my life before. Colonel Lean came to the recital, and introduced himself to me. He became a visitor at my house in London, which, by the by, had been changed for one in a terrace, and 2 years afterwards, in June 1879, we were married. I have so far overcome a natural scruple to make my private affairs public, in justice to Lottie Fowler. It is useless narrating anything to do with the supernatural, although I have been taught that this is a wrong term, and that nothing that exists is above nature, but only a continuation of it, unless one is prepared to prove that it was true. Lottie Fowler did not make a long stay in England on that occasion. She returned to America for some time, and I was Mrs. Lean before I met her again. The second visit was a remarkable one. I had been to another medium, who had made me very unhappy by some prophecies with regard to my husband's health. Indeed, she had said he would not live a couple of years, and I was so excited about it that my friend Miss Scomberg advised our going then and there to see Lottie Fowler, who had just arrived in England, and was staying in Vernon Place, Bloomsbury, and though it was late at night, we set off at once. The answer to our request to see Miss Fowler was that she was too tired to receive any more visitors that day. "Do ask her to see me," I urged. "I won't detain her a moment, I only want to ask her one question." Upon this, we were admitted, and found Lottie nearly asleep. "Miss Fowler," I began, "you told me 5 years ago that I should be married a second time." "Well, I am married, and now they tell me I shall lose my husband." And then I told her how ill he was, and what the doctor said, and what the medium said. "You told me the truth before," I continued, "tell it me now. Will he die?" Lottie took a locket containing his hair in her hand for a minute, and then replied confidently,
They know nothing about it. He will not die, that is not yet, not for a long while.
"But when?" I said, despairingly.
Leave that to God, child,
She answered,
and be happy now.
and in effect Colonel Lean recovered from his illness, and became strong and hearty again. But whence did Miss Fowler gain the confidence to assert that a man whom she had never seen, nor even heard of, should recover from a disease which the doctors pronounced to be mortal? From that time Lottie and I became fast friends, and continue so to this day. It is a remarkable thing that she would never take a sixpence from me in payment for her services, though I have sat with her scores of times, nor would she accept a present, and that when she has been sorely in need of funds. She said she had been told she should never prosper if she touched my money. She has one of the most grateful and affectionate and generous natures possible, and has half-starved herself for the sake of others who lived upon her. I have seen her under sickness, and poverty, and trouble, and I think she is one of the kindest-hearted and best women living, and I am glad of even this slight opportunity to bear testimony to her disposition. At one time she had a large and fashionable clientele of sitters, who used to pay her handsomely for a séance, but of late years her clients have fallen off, and her fortunes have proportionately decreased. She has now returned to the southern states of America, and says she has seen the last of England. All I can say is, that I consider her a great personal loss as a referee in all business matters as well as a prophet for the future. She also, like Bessie Fitzgerald, is a great medical diagnoser. She was largely consulted by physicians about the court at the time of the Prince of Wales' dangerous illness, and predicted his recovery from the commencement. It was through her mediumship that the body of the late Lord Lindesay of Balcurs, which was stolen from the family vault, was eventually recovered, and the present Lord Lindesay gave her a beautiful little watch, enamelled and set in diamonds, in commemoration of the event. She predicted the riot that took place in London some years ago, and the Tay Bridge disaster, but who is so silly as to believe the prophecies of media nowadays? There has hardly been an event in my life, since I have known Lottie Fowler, that she has not prepared me for beforehand, but the majority of them are too insignificant to interest the reader. One, however, the saddest I have ever been called upon to encounter, was wonderfully foretold. In February, 1886, Lottie, or rather, Annie, said to me,
There is a great trouble in store for you, Florence.
She always called me Florence.
You are passing under black clouds, and there is a coffin hanging over you. It will leave your house.
This made me very uneasy. No one lived in my house but my husband and myself. I asked, is it my own coffin?
No.
Is it my husband's?
No. It is that of a much younger person.
I questioned her very closely, but she would not tell me any more, and I tried to dismiss the idea from my mind. Still it would constantly recur, for I knew, from experience, how true her predictions were. At last I felt as if I could bear the suspense no longer, and I went to her and said, "You must tell me that the coffin you spoke of is not for one of my children, or the uncertainty will drive me mad." Annie thought a minute, and then said slowly,
"No, it is not for one of your children."
"Then I can bear anything else," I replied. The time went on, and in April an uncle of mine died. I rushed again to Lottie Fowler. "Is this the death you prophesied?" I asked her.
"No,"
she replied.
"The coffin must leave your house, but this death will be followed by another in the family."
Which it was within the week. The following February my next-door neighbors lost their only son. I had known the boy for years, and I was very sorry for them. As I was watching the funeral preparations from my bedroom window, I saw the coffin carried out of the hall door, which adjoined mine with only a railing between. Knowing that many prophetical media see the future in a series of pictures, it struck me that Lottie must have seen this coffin leaving, and mistaken the house for mine. I went to her again. This proves how the prediction had weighed all this time upon my mind. "Has not the death you spoke of taken place now?" I asked her. "Has not the coffin left my house?"
"No,"
she answered.
"It will be a relative, one of the family. It is much nearer now than it was."
I felt uncomfortable, but I would not allow it to make me unhappy. Annie had said it was not one of my own children, and so long as they were spared I felt strong enough for anything. In the July following, my eldest daughter came to me in much distress. She had heard of the death of a friend, one who had been associated with her in her professional life, and the news had shocked her greatly. She had always been opposed to spiritualism. She didn't see the good of it, and thought I believed in it a great deal more than was necessary. I had often asked her to accompany me to séances, or to see trance media, and she had refused. She used to say she had no one on the other side she cared to speak to. But when her young friend died, she begged me to take her to a medium to hear some news of him, and we went together to Lottie Fowler. Annie did not wait for any prompting, but opened the ball at once.
"You've come here to ask me how you can see your friend who has just passed over,"
she said.
"Well, he's all right. He's in this room now. And he says you will see him very soon."
To which medium shall I go?
Said my daughter.
"Don't go to any medium. Wait a little while, and you will see him with your own eyes."
My daughter was a physical medium herself, though I had prevented her sitting for fear it should injure her health, and I believed, with her, that Annie meant that her friend would manifest through her own power. She turned to me and said,
"Oh, mother, I shall be awfully frightened if he appears to me at night."
and Annie answered,
"No, you won't be frightened when you see him. You will be very pleased. Your meeting will be a source of great pleasure on both sides."
My daughter had just signed a lucrative engagement, and was about to start on a provincial tour. Her next request was,
"Tell me what you see for me in the future."
Annie replied,
"I cannot see it clearly. Another day I may be able to tell you more. But today it is all dim. Every time I try to see it, a wall seems to rise behind your head and shut it out."
Then she turned to me and said,
"Florence, that coffin is very near you now. It hangs right over your head."
I answered carelessly, "I wish it would come and have done with it. It is 18 months now, Annie, since you uttered that dismal prophecy." Little did I really believe that it was to be so quickly and so terribly fulfilled. 3 weeks after that séance, my beloved child, who was staying with me, was carried out of my house in her coffin to Kensal Green. I was so stunned by the blow, that it was not for some time after that I remembered Annie's prediction. When I asked her why she had tortured me with the suspense of coming evil for 18 months, she said she had been told to do so by my guardian spirits, or my brain would have been injured by the suddenness of the shock. When I asked why she had denied it would be one of my children, she still maintained that she had obeyed a higher order, because to tell the truth so long beforehand would have half killed me, as indeed it would. Annie said she had no idea, even during that last interview, that the death she predicted was that of the girl before her. She saw her future was misty, and that the coffin was over my head, but she did not connect the two facts together. In like manner I have heard almost every event of my future through Lottie Fowler's lips, and she has never yet proved to be wrong, except in one instance of time. She predicted an event for a certain year and it did not take place till afterwards, and it has made Annie so wary that she steadfastly refuses now to give any dates. I always warn inquirers not to place faith in any given dates. The spirits have told me they have no time in the spheres, but judge of it simply as the reflection of the future appears nearer, or further, from the sitter's face. Thus, something that will happen years hence appears cloudy and far off, whilst the events of next week or next month seem bright and distinct, and quite near. This is a method of judging which can only be gained by practice, and must at all times be uncertain and misleading. I have often acted as amanuensis for Lottie Fowler, for letters are constantly arriving for her from every part of the world which can only be answered under trance, and she has asked me to take down the replies as Annie dictated them. I have answered by this means the most searching questions from over the seas relating to health and money and lost articles whilst Lottie was fast asleep and Annie dictated the letters, and have received many answers thanking me for acting go-between, and saying how wonderfully correct and valuable the information Annie had sent them had proved to be. Of course, it would be impossible, in this paper, to tell of the constant intercourse I have had with Lottie Fowler during the last 10 or 12 years, and the manner in which she has mapped out my future for me, preventing my cherishing false hopes that would never be realized, making bad bargains that would prove monetary losses, and believing in apparent friendship that was only a cloak for selfishness and treachery. I have learned many bitter lessons from her lips. I have also made a good deal of money through her means. She has told me what will happen to me between this time and the time of my death, and I feel prepared for the evil and content with the good. Lottie Fowler had very bad health for some time before she left England, and it had become quite necessary that she should go, but I think if the British public had known what a wonderful woman was in their midst, they would have made it better worth her while to stay amongst them,